I thought I was just taking a train ride to sign some paperwork. I had the folder on my lap, thick, cream-colored, stamped with the notary's seal, and I was watching the Connecticut countryside dissolve into a watercolor blur of gray-brown trees and flat November sky, thinking about nothing more consequential than what we might have for dinner. I had no idea that within the next 2 hours, a white-haired stranger on the 11:14 to Hartford would hand me the first piece of a truth I had been unknowingly circling for 8 months, that my husband would be revealed as something I could not yet name without my voice breaking, and that the house my grandmother had left me, the only thing in this world that was entirely unconditionally mine, would turn out to be the center of a plan so meticulously constructed it would take my breath away for all the wrong reasons. The old woman was sitting across the aisle, 1 seat forward, and I had noticed her the way you notice a lamp in a waiting room, peripherally, without real attention. She was small and very upright, dressed in a dark wool coat that looked like it had outlasted at least 3 American presidents, her silver hair pinned into a careful bun with the kind of precision that signals lifelong habit. She held a battered paperback open in both hands, but she wasn't reading it. Her eyes were still, her posture alert, and she had the particular quality of watchfulness that very old women sometimes possess, the kind earned through decades of paying attention when nobody thought they were. Daniel was beside me, his shoulder warm against mine, his thumb moving in the rapid, repetitive scroll he used when he was anxious. Up, pause, never landing on anything long enough to actually read it. He'd been quiet since we boarded at Grand Central, the kind of quiet that has texture, that sits between 2 people like an object with weight and temperature. I told myself it was just the stress of the visit. Eleanor Marsh had that effect on her son. She tightened him like a string tuned too high, and I had learned, over 3 years of marriage, to interpret his pre-Eleanor silences as something manageable rather than something to investigate. That morning, standing in our Brooklyn kitchen with the smell of burnt toast still in the air and his keys scraping across the counter in the familiar way they always did, I had thought, this will be fine. One afternoon, one conversation, and then it will be over. I had been wrong about a great many things. He had handed me the water bottle before we boarded. I was remembering that now, replaying it with the particular clarity that arrives when you start looking backward at things you didn't think to question in the moment. He'd reached into his bag without looking at me, plucked it out with a small, deliberate motion, and extended it in my direction. "Stay hydrated," he'd said, with a half-smile that didn't quite make it to his eyes. I'd taken it and thanked him and tucked it into the seat pocket in front of me, because that is what you do when your husband of 3 years hands you a water bottle. You take it. You say thank you. You do not wonder. I was reaching for it now, lips parting, fingers closing around the cool plastic, when the old woman moved. It was barely perceptible, the kind of shift that registers more in the peripheral nervous system than in conscious sight. A tilt of her torso, a slow, deliberate turn of her head, and then her eyes met mine across the narrow aisle. They were dark and very clear, and the expression in them was not the vacant friendliness of a stranger about to make small talk. She leaned forward until I could smell her perfume, something dry and floral, like roses pressed between book pages for a very long time. And her voice, when it came, was so quiet it was almost absorbed entirely by the rhythm of the wheels on the track. "Don't drink the water, dear." I went completely still. The bottle was an inch from my lips. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds. I counted them, the way you count the details of moments that will matter later. And then she turned back to her paperback as calmly as if she had merely commented on the weather, as if she had said nothing at all. The train moved. The man 2 rows back laughed at something on his phone. A child in the seat ahead kicked the tray table once, twice. The world went on in its ordinary, indifferent way, and I sat there with the bottle in my hand and a feeling moving up the back of my neck that I had no clean name for yet. I set the bottle back in the pocket. Daniel hadn't looked up from his phone. A minute passed. Then, without looking, without any visible deliberateness, he reached past me, picked up the bottle, and drank from it in 3 long, unconscious swallows. He set it back. He scrolled. Nothing happened. Nothing visible. Nothing that would have meant anything to anyone watching. But I could not stop hearing the way she had said it. The flatness of it. The absence of urgency that somehow contained more urgency than a shout. Don't drink the water, dear. Not a suggestion, not a concern. A fact delivered by someone who already knew exactly what kind of fact it was. I need to go back further than the train because the train is not where this story begins. It is only where the mask finally slipped enough for me to see what had been underneath it all along. My name is Kate Brennan. Kate Marsh, technically, since I had taken Daniel's last name when we married, though I had been thinking about that decision lately in a way that I still lacked clean language for. I was 34 years old. I worked from home as a graphic designer with a steady roster of clients, mostly independent publishers, small brands, the occasional nonprofit, and I had built something quiet and entirely mine over the course of 7 years, the kind of work life that doesn't impress people at parties, but sustains you in the particular, unglamorous way that actually matters. I made good money. I was proud of my work with the private, understated satisfaction my grandmother had always modeled. You did not announce the things worth being proud of. You simply held them. The house was what made me worth targeting. Margaret Brennan had died 18 months before this train ride, leaving behind a Victorian farmhouse in Woodstock, Vermont, that she had owned outright since 1987 and maintained with the fierce, unhurried devotion she brought to everything she loved. Wide pine floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, a wraparound porch that creaked in a specific, familiar way on the third board from the left, a kitchen window over the sink where she kept a small pot of mint from a local farm stand every summer, and where the light came in sideways on October mornings and turned the whole room the color of warm honey. She left the house to me, specifically, bypassing my parents and the half-dozen cousins who had spent her final 2 years performing attentiveness with the focused energy of people doing arithmetic. Her lawyer read me her letter in a sunlit office that smelled of old paper and floor polish, to Kate, who loved this house for what it was and not for what it was worth. I had cried for 20 minutes in the parking lot and then driven home to Brooklyn with the windows down despite the cold. And in the 18 months since, I'd visited the house only 4 times because every room still smelled like her. Cedar and lavender soap and that particular quality of stillness she had carried with her through 81 years of living, and I was not yet ready to change anything about it. The house was appraised at $840,000. I had no intention of selling. I had no intention of doing anything with it yet. I simply wanted it to remain in the world intact for a little while longer. I wanted to grieve at my own pace, in my own time, without anyone's interference. Eleanor had different intentions. I had met Daniel's mother 6 weeks into our relationship at a dinner she'd organized with the systematic care of someone staging an interrogation. She served a roast she'd spent the day on, used her best dishes, and asked me questions. Where I'd gone to school, what my parents did, whether I rented or owned, where I saw myself in 10 years, all delivered in a pleasant, conversational tone that made due diligence sound like interest. I had answered everything warmly because I was 29 and newly in love and determined to make this work, and afterward Daniel said she'd like me very much. I had believed him completely. Eleanor was, in those early years, what I would describe as manageable. Strong, immovable preferences about the shape of family life, how often we visited, how holidays were organized, how a Sunday phone call should go. But I had grown up with a mother who expressed love through expectation, so navigating another woman's standards felt familiar, if not entirely comfortable. We were not warm, but we were civil, with the careful, mutual politeness of 2 countries that share a border and a complicated history. The shift began 8 months after my grandmother died. It came first in questions. Small, precise questions dropped into the margins of ordinary conversations with the offhand deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed them. "Have you thought about what you'll do with the Vermont property?" she asked at Christmas, passing the gravy. Real estate up there is moving beautifully right now. Such a shame to let something like that sit. I said we weren't thinking about selling, and she nodded and changed the subject, and I filed it under Eleanor being Eleanor and let it go. Then suggestions: an agent she knew, a property manager who handled estates with a great deal of discretion, an accountant who specialized in inheritance tax. Each one delivered in the same pleasant, caring tone. Each one declined politely. Each one followed by Daniel's vague, slightly embarrassed echo of my position. He was trying to keep the peace. I understood that. I had always understood that. What I had not understood was that keeping the peace and keeping secrets are not the same thing. Then, 3 months ago, the document. She had sent it through Daniel, forwarded in an email with the subject line, "Thoughts from Mom," a PDF she described in her covering note as just a draft for discussion. It was a co-ownership agreement for the Vermont property, proposing that Daniel be added to the deed as an equal co-owner with shared decision-making rights. There was a clause about what would happen to the property in the event of marital dissolution that I read 3 times before I fully grasped its implications. I had called Daniel immediately, my voice quiet and controlled. "I'm not willing to discuss this," I said. He said, I know, she just worries, she means well." I said, "Daniel, she is asking me to sign away half of my grandmother's house." He said, "Let's talk about it in person." And then we had not talked about it in person, not really, and the document had sat in my email like a splinter too deep to reach. And 3 months later, I was on this train, heading north to Eleanor's house in the Connecticut hills with a folder of documents in my lap and a water bottle in the seat pocket that a stranger had just told me not to drink from. I had thought the deed itself, the solid, notarized, unambiguous document naming me as sole owner, was enough armor for whatever conversation Eleanor had planned. I had thought that if she could simply see it stated plainly in legal language, she would have to acknowledge there was nothing to negotiate. I had not thought to check what Daniel had packed. It was 43 minutes into the journey when he stood and excused himself to use the bathroom at the end of the car. He moved down the aisle with the easy, unhurried gait of a man who had nothing to hide. I watched him go. I looked out the window. I looked at the old woman sitting across the aisle with her unread paperback and her watchful, unhurried stillness. I looked at Daniel's bag in the overhead rack. I don't know what made me reach for it. Whatever it was, the warning, the months of accumulated unease, some deep internal signal I had been quietly ignoring for far too long. I stood up, lifted his bag down, and set it in my lap. It was lighter than I expected. His laptop was zipped in the outer pocket. The small leather toiletry case he'd had since before we met sat beside a rolled change of clothes. And behind the laptop, pressed flat against the inner panel of the bag, a plain manila envelope with no label, no name, nothing written on its surface at all. My hands were steady. That was the strange part. I had always imagined that the moment something truly terrible revealed itself, the body would respond dramatically, the way it does in films. Shaking hands, a sharp intake of breath, the world going slow. But my hands were perfectly still as I slid the papers out and began to read. The first document was a property transfer agreement. The address on the first line was my grandmother's house on Maple Hill Road in Woodstock, Vermont. The transferring party was listed as Catherine Ann Marsh. The signature at the bottom of page 3 looked, at a fast and unprepared glance, indistinguishable from my own. I turned to the second page, then the third, a notarized power of attorney, granting Daniel Michael Marsh full legal authority to make decisions regarding the property on my behalf. My signature again at the bottom, dated and witnessed. 6 days ago, a Tuesday. I had been in Brooklyn on that Tuesday. I had not signed anything. I had not been anywhere near a notary. I had not given anyone on earth permission to put my name on a single sheet of paper. But I recognized the handwriting, not because it was my own, because I had seen it for 3 years on birthday cards and Christmas envelopes, in the small, precise, deliberate loops of a woman who controlled every surface she touched. Eleanor. I slid the papers back into the envelope. I put the envelope back in the bag. I placed the bag back in the overhead rack and sat down and smoothed my skirt across my knees with both hands. The train ran north through the cold November landscape, and I was very, very quiet inside, the way a house goes quiet in the exact moment before the power cuts out. Daniel came back. He settled into his seat with the easy familiarity of a man returning to something safe. He picked up his phone. He turned and smiled at me. The warm, open, entirely unguarded smile that had been, for 4 years, the thing I trusted most in the world. "About 30 minutes," he said. "She's probably already got lunch going." "Probably," I said. I turned to the window. In its dark reflection, I could see the old woman across the aisle. She was watching me, open and unhurried, with the expression of someone who had already survived something like this and knew there was no shortcut through what came next. This time, when she gave me her small, careful nod, I nodded back. Eleanor's house sat at the end of a gravel driveway that curved through a stand of bare maples, their branches webbing against the gray November sky in a pattern that always reminded me, uncomfortably, of something reaching. The house itself was large and immaculate, white clappered with dark green shutters, every window symmetrical, every shrub trimmed with the same exacting care Eleanor applied to all surfaces she controlled. There were flower boxes on the front porch, empty now and waiting for spring, and a wreath on the door made of dried hydrangeas and stiff ribbon that managed to look welcoming and defensive at the same time. Beautiful, in the way of things that are meant to signal rather than feel. Daniel's aunt's car was already in the driveway. I noted that small, deliberate fact and said nothing about it. The smell of the house hit me the moment the door opened. A warm, layered smell of roasting garlic and something sweet, maybe apple, and beneath it the ever-present undercurrent of Eleanor's perfume, a heavy floral that clung to every surface and had always made me feel, slightly but persistently, like I was visiting someone else's world rather than entering a shared one. She was already in the hallway when we came through the door, wearing an apron over a cream-colored blouse, her silver hair smooth, her lipstick precisely applied, the picture of a woman who had spent the morning doing nothing in particular and wanted you to know it had been effortless. "Kate," she said, with a warmth so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine, and she embraced me, both hands on my arms, the kiss that just missed my cheek, the brief, fragrant compression of her, and I returned it with the reflexive politeness of someone performing a well-rehearsed part. And I smiled, and I let her take my coat, and I followed her into the dining room where Patricia, Eleanor's sister, a quieter, smaller echo of her, was already seated with a glass of water, and a look on her face I could not quite read. Neutral, I would have said. Watching. "Patricia," I said, "I didn't know you'd be here." "Eleanor thought it would be nice," Patricia said, and her eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, to a folder on the edge of the sideboard before returning to mine. The folder was the color of a legal envelope. It was thick and flat and placed with the specific precision of something that has been positioned rather than set down. I looked at Daniel. He was hanging his jacket on the hook near the door, and his shoulder blades were pulled in and up, an involuntary posture of bracing. He did not turn around immediately. Lunch was a performance of the highest order. Eleanor served everything herself. The roasted vegetables, the bread in its linen-lined basket, moving between kitchen and table with the graceful efficiency of a woman who used hospitality as architecture, who built structures out of serving dishes and small talk and carefully positioned compliments, and underneath whose warmth was always the faint hum of a different agenda entirely. She asked about my work. She complimented the bag I'd set near the door, the one with my notary folder in it, and the specific way she said, "Lovely bag, Kate," eyes lingering half a second too long, produced in me a sensation I could only describe as the sudden drop of a room temperature. She asked about friends, about Brooklyn, about whether we'd been back to Vermont recently, and her tone never changed. Pleasant, fond, inclusive. And the whole time, underneath her questions, I heard the woman on the train like a second frequency running below audible range. "Don't drink the water, dear. I ate almost nothing." I drank the coffee Eleanor had made, which I watched her pour directly from the pot into my cup herself, which I decided was probably fine, which I decided to stop thinking about for the sake of remaining functional. I watched Daniel eat. He ate steadily and without real appetite, occasionally looking at me with something that was not quite a smile and not quite an apology, and was probably both. Patricia made small, agreeable noises at appropriate intervals and watched the space between Eleanor and me the way people watch a stage before the curtain rises. It was Eleanor who moved us to the living room. It was Eleanor who settled us into chairs with the gentle authority of someone arranging pieces. It was Eleanor who let a beat of silence fall, just long enough to reshape the room, and then said in the voice she used for things she had decided were already settled, "I wanted to talk about the Vermont property." I set my coffee cup on the side table with deliberate steadiness. "All right," I said. "I've had some conversations," she said. And the word conversations, stripped of any specific names or context, landed in the room with the soft, heavy thud of something being carefully hidden in plain sight. With people who are very experienced in this kind of situation, and I think there's a path forward that makes sense for everyone. For the family, for your future, Kate, for Daniel's security. She paused, letting each noun do its work. The property has appreciated significantly. It would be a shame not to leverage that strategically. "I'm not interested in selling," I said. My voice was very quiet and very even. Eleanor smiled with her mouth. "Of course not selling outright. No one is suggesting anything like that, but formalizing Daniel's role in the ownership structure would protect you both, legally, financially, in the long run, if anything were to happen." The word happen floated there, wrapped in solicitude, hiding something sharp at its center. A marriage is a partnership, Kate. Property in one person's name creates vulnerabilities. "My grandmother left that house to me specifically," I said. "It's in the will. It's in the deed. The language is very clear." "Of course," Eleanor said, "and no one is disputing that. This would simply be a formalization of what your marriage already means." She reached toward the sideboard and her fingers closed around the legal envelope with the ease of someone reaching for something they've touched many times. She set it on the coffee table between us. "I've had our family attorney draw something up, just to look at." I did not touch the envelope. I looked at it. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the carpet. "Daniel," I said. He looked up. His eyes were a color I can only describe as sorry, the particular sorry that lives in people who have done something they can't take back and know it. "Kate," he started, I thought if we could all talk it through together." "You knew about this," I said. It was not a question. "He was part of the conversation, yes," Eleanor said with the smooth, redirecting speed of someone who has anticipated this exact moment and prepared for it. "We all want the same thing, Kate. Security, stability, a plan that protects everyone." The room was very warm. I could hear the furnace, a low, steady hum from beneath the floorboards, and the occasional tick of the radiator by the window, and outside, wind moving through the bare maples in the driveway. I thought of the papers in Daniel's bag, the transfer agreement, the power of attorney, the signature that was not my signature. I thought about what it meant that they existed, that they had been prepared, notarized, dated 6 days ago without my knowledge and without my consent. I thought about the fact that forgery on a real estate deed is a felony in every state in America, that a forged deed is void as a matter of law, that nothing Eleanor or Daniel had done could actually transfer the property without my cooperation, but that the attempt itself, the paper trail, the network of quiet conversations and carefully positioned legal documents told me everything I needed to know about what had been planned and for how long. I stood up. "I'd like to use the bathroom," I said. "Excuse me." In the bathroom, I ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in Eleanor's mirror, which was oval and framed in dark wood and very clean. I looked ordinary. I looked calm. The person looking back at me from that clean oval mirror had been in this house dozens of times and sat at that table and eaten that food and deflected those questions and held that particular quiet the way you hold something that could cut you if you squeezed too hard. I had spent 3 years being careful, being patient, being the woman who did not make things difficult, who took the longer road around the problem, who told herself the distance was worth the peace. I looked at that woman in Eleanor's bathroom mirror, and I thought, with a clarity that arrived not as heat, but as the precise, terrible cold of absolute certainty. No more. I dried my hands. I smoothed my hair. I took my phone from my pocket and I dialed my father. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, the way he had always done, as if he had spent my whole life positioned just close enough to the phone to catch whatever I might need to say. Katie. His voice was the same warm, low register it had always been. The voice of the man who had driven me to the emergency room at 2 a.m. when I was 19, who had sat outside the testing center when I took my business licensing exam, who had, 6 months ago, said to me across the kitchen table with the careful gentleness of someone who had been waiting to say it, "I don't like the way that woman talks about your grandmother's house." "Dad," I said. My voice was steady. "I need you to call your attorney, the one who handled Grandma's estate. I need you to call him right now, and I need you to tell him I'm going to need an emergency consultation. Today, if possible." A pause of exactly the right length. What happened? Eleanor forged my signature on a property transfer agreement and a power of attorney for the Vermont house, dated 6 days ago. I found them in Daniel's bag on the train. Another pause. Shorter this time, because my father was not a man who lingered in shock. "Are the documents on you?" "No. They're in Daniel's bag. I saw them and I put them back." "Good. Leave them there for now. Are you safe?" "Yes. I'm in her bathroom." "Okay. I'm calling Tom right now. Do not sign anything. Do not touch anything they put in front of you. And Katie, don't let them know you've seen the documents yet. Can you do that for another 20 minutes? "Yes," I said. And I meant it. I came back to the living room with the composed face of a woman who has simply used the bathroom and found it pleasant. I sat back down. I picked up my coffee cup. I looked at Eleanor's envelope on the table between us, and I said, "Tell me more about what you're proposing," with a warm, open, interested tone of someone who has just arrived at the conversation. Eleanor straightened almost imperceptibly, the way a performer does when the audience re-engages, and began to speak with renewed fluency. And Daniel looked at me with a careful, uncertain hope that made something inside me ache and harden at the same time. Patricia watched me with the same watchful stillness she had maintained all afternoon, and now I understood it. She was not a neutral witness. She was here as a supporting presence, the warm, quiet corroboration of a plan that needed more than one person to appear reasonable. I thought about the old woman on the train, her dark, clear eyes, the way she had said it without explanation, and then turned back to her paperback as if what happened next was no longer hers to manage. I thought about what she had known and how she had known it. I thought, someone told her. Someone who had been in this room before me. "The agreement protects you too," Eleanor was saying. "If anything were to happen to Daniel—" "Nothing is going to happen to Daniel," I said pleasantly. "Of course not. But planning for the future is simply responsible." "I agree," I said, "which is why I've retained an attorney." The room shifted. It was subtle, a slight stiffening, a fraction of increased stillness. But I had been watching Eleanor's face carefully enough to see the exact moment the calculation behind it recalibrated. "Of course," she said, her voice losing none of its warmth, gaining only the faintest edge of deliberateness. "That's very sensible." "Yes," I said, "I thought so." Daniel was looking at me now. His expression had passed through uncertainty and arrived somewhere more complex, somewhere that contained the beginning of genuine fear. He said very quietly, "Kate." "I'm fine," I said, and I turned and looked at him fully, without armor or management, just the direct, unmediated gaze of a woman looking at a man she had trusted and asking him, silently and without any hope of an adequate answer, How long? He looked away first. My father's attorney, Tom Gallagher, called me back 42 minutes later, while I was sitting in the passenger seat of Daniel's car with my coat on and my hands in my lap and the whole bare November landscape moving past the windows. Daniel was driving. Eleanor had embraced me at the door with the same warm, comprehensive ease she always used, her perfume enveloping me briefly, and I had returned it with the same careful performance. And she had said, "We'll talk more soon," and I had said, "Of course," and I had walked to the car with the quiet of a woman who has made a decision and does not need to announce it. Tom spoke concisely and with the particular authority of a man who had spent 30 years in property and estate law and had seen most of what people did to each other over real estate. He said, "A forged deed is void as a matter of law. The forgery itself, regardless of notarization, transfers nothing." He said, "Presenting forged documents constitutes a felony in Connecticut, where Eleanor resided, with potential penalties of up to 10 years and fines exceeding $10,000. He said, "The forged power of attorney, similarly, constituted criminal fraud and opened Eleanor and any co-conspirator to both criminal prosecution and civil liability." He said, "What I needed to do in the next 24 hours was to document the existence of those papers without alerting Eleanor or Daniel that I had seen them, which meant I needed someone to photograph the contents of Daniel's bag before it was unpacked or those papers were destroyed. Someone," Tom said, "who has access to the bag right now." I looked out the window. Daniel's hands were on the wheel. He was watching the road with the slightly forward, effortful concentration of someone who is working very hard not to look at the person beside them. "Daniel," I said, "pull over, please." He did. A gas station, bright fluorescent, the wind moving a plastic bag across the empty lot. He put the car in park and turned toward me with his whole body, and his face was the face of a man standing at the edge of something he'd been standing at the edge of for a very long time, waiting for the ground to hold or give way. "How long have you known about the documents in your bag?" I said. He closed his eyes, opened them. "Kate." "How long?" "She asked me to carry them," he said. She said it was just a draft. She said if you saw them naturally, in context, you'd be more open." "She forged my signature, Daniel." I kept my voice at the same exact measured level. "She signed my name to a property transfer and a power of attorney on documents she created with the intention of using them to take my grandmother's house." I watched him. He was very pale now. "Did you know she intended to forge my signature, or did you believe they were documents I had already signed?" The pause lasted long enough to answer the question on its own. Then, "She said you'd agreed, verbally, that you just needed to see it in writing to make it feel real. And you believed that. I wanted—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to believe it was possible. I wanted to believe she had found a way to make it work without—" He stopped again, and this time he did not start again, and the silence between us had the particular texture of something that will not be unsaid. "Without what?" I said. "Without it being this bad," he said. I took my phone from my coat pocket. "I'm going to ask you to do one thing," I said. "One thing right now. If you want any possibility of what comes after this being something other than what it would otherwise be, you will do this one thing." He was looking at me with the full attention of a person who has run out of alternatives. "Take your bag from the back seat, open the inner panel, give me the manila envelope." He was very still for a long moment. Then he reached into the back seat. Tom Gallagher arrived at our Brooklyn apartment 2 days later with a colleague who specialized in criminal fraud. I sat across the table from them with the manila envelope, its contents now photographed, documented, and certified by a third-party notary. And I watched them work through the documents with the unhurried precision of people doing something they had done before and would likely do again. The transfer agreement was void. The power of attorney was void. Eleanor had committed document fraud and signature forgery in relation to real property, which under Connecticut law carried felony-level charges. The notary whose seal appeared on the documents, a woman named Greta Holt, whose office was 3 blocks from Eleanor's house, had, according to Tom's initial inquiry, no record of Catherine Ann Marsh appearing in her office on the date in question. That, he said, was an additional count. The police report was filed on a Thursday. Eleanor was informed by her own attorney on a Friday morning. The call that came through to Daniel's phone that afternoon, which he took in the kitchen while I sat in the living room and heard only the shape of, without the words, the modulated rise and pressure of Eleanor's voice, even through the closed door, lasted 11 minutes. When Daniel came back into the living room, his face had the stunned, colorless quality of someone who had just realized that the thing they had been hoping would not happen had happened. He sat down across from me and said nothing for a long time. "She said it was all a misunderstanding," he finally said. "I know she did," I said. "She said you were making things difficult, that you were being vindictive." I said nothing. "I know," he said. "I know." He put his face in his hands briefly, lifted it again. "I didn't know about the signature, Kate. I want you to believe that. I know you might not, but I genuinely... She told me you'd agreed. She said you were just going to need some encouragement to formalize it. I should have..." He stopped. "I should have asked you directly. I should have verified. I should have done 100 things differently." He looked at his hands. "I know that doesn't fix it." "No," I said, "it doesn't." Eleanor did not go to trial. Her attorney, a sharp, pragmatic man named Clifford Vance, who had, it turned out, advised her against the plan from the beginning, negotiated a settlement that included a formal cease and desist regarding any claim against the Vermont property, a written retraction and acknowledgement of the fraudulent documents, and a financial penalty that, while not ruinous, was significant enough to constitute a genuine consequence. The notary lost her certification. The transfer documents were formally voided, and a record of the void was entered into the county property records in Vermont. The house on Maple Hill Road remained, immovably, legally, permanently, mine. Patricia called me once, 3 weeks later. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail in which she said she wanted me to know that she had tried to talk Eleanor out of it, and that she was sorry, and that she hoped things would work out for Daniel and me. She had, she said, told someone on the train that day, an old friend, a woman who sometimes took that route, that she was worried something bad was about to happen and that she hoped someone would notice. I listened to that voicemail 4 times, standing in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, and each time I finished it, I set the phone on the counter and stood very still for a moment, thinking about the oval face of the woman across the aisle and the way she'd leaned forward and the way she'd turned back to her book without another word, and what it meant that kindness could look like that. Small, precise, placed exactly where it was needed, and then gone. Daniel and I separated in January, not because he had been the architect of the plan. He hadn't been. And I believe that, eventually, with the particular slow certainty of someone who has looked at a thing from every angle, but because the months that followed showed me, in the unhurried and inarguable way, that real things reveal themselves, that he was a man who would always choose the path of least conflict, who would mistake his mother's certainty for wisdom, who would carry envelopes he hadn't opened because it was easier than asking questions. That is not a villain. That is, in some ways, more painful than a villain. I could not build a life on a foundation of things left unasked. We were civil. We divided what needed to be divided with the sad, practical dignity of 2 people who had genuinely loved each other and were now acknowledging what that love had not been enough to hold. By the following September, I was sitting on the wraparound porch of the house on Maple Hill Road with a cup of coffee and a thin quilt around my shoulders, and the morning light coming in sideways through the maples, turning the dew-covered boards the color of warm honey. A pot of mint sat on the windowsill inside the kitchen, in the same spot where my grandmother had always kept hers. The third board from the left creaked in the familiar way when I shifted my weight, and the yard below the porch steps was turning slowly, gorgeously, from summer green to the first tentative blush of early fall color. I had driven up alone, and I intended to stay for 2 weeks, the longest I had spent here since my grandmother died, And it was the first time since I'd walked through that door, the first true time, that the rooms had smelled like something other than absence. They smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the particular clean cold of a Vermont morning, and underneath, very faint, cedar and lavender soap. I thought about the old woman on the train with her dark, watchful eyes and her dry, pressed flower perfume and the absolute economy of her warning. 4 words, deployed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where they would land. I thought about the things she could not have saved me from and the one thing she had. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting in that lawyer's letter to Kate, who loved this house for what it was and not for what it was worth. I set my coffee cup on the porch railing. The morning was very quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full. Full of birds and distance and the slow, unhurried turning of the season. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders and I looked out at the yard that was mine, at the light that was mine, at the long, particular silence of a life that had been fought for and kept, and I thought, this is what it feels like when the thing that was always yours finally knows it too.